on today's StoryBeat.
I was doing an interview for the Total Television book, interviewing this voice artist named Bradley Bolke, who did the voice of Chumley the Walrus on Tennessee Tuxedo. And he answers the phone. And he goes, "Hello," and he sounds just like Chumley the Walrus. So I'm like, brought me back to being like 3 years old.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Mark Arnold, is a comic book, animation, and pop culture historian. He's published 10 books and numerous articles in various publications. His books include The Harveyville Fun Times, If You're Cracked, You're Happy, the story of Cracked Magazine, Book 1 and Book 2. Mark Arnold picks on the Beatles, Frozen in Ice, the story of Walt Disney Productions 1966 to 1985. Think Pink, the DePatie-Freleng story, as well as books on Total Television Productions, Dennis the Menace, the Monkees, and Alvin and the Chipmunks. Mark's latest books are about the music group The Turtles and a 2-volume Mad magazine history, all of which came out in 2024. I've read both Unconditionally Mad Part 1 and Unconditionally Mad Part B, and can tell you they're deeply and thoroughly researched histories of the ongoing 7 decades run of Mad magazine. If you want to know all about the people behind some of the most hilarious writing and drawing ever, as well as other pop culture sensations, I highly recommend you check out all of Mark's books. He's also produced and recorded DVD commentaries for Shout Factory and Kino Lorber, and has helped the Cartoon Art Museum and the Schnitzer Museum with various art shows. Mark also hosts the Fun Ideas podcast. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my distinct privilege to welcome the author and pop culture historian, Mark Arnold, to StoryBeat today. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on the show, believe me. So let's go back in time just a little bit. When was it, at what age was it when you first fell in love with animation, comic books, and other pop culture sensations?
Probably comic books were first. I remember them just being around. I didn't really collect them. They were just around when I was a kid. And we seemed to have a little variety of everything. I can name the titles even because it wasn't too many. It was a handful of things. So we had a Casper issue. We had a Wendy issue. There was an Underdog issue, a Scooby-Doo, Walt Disney Comics and Stories, Mighty Thor, just a little March of Comics of Three Stooges, March of Comics of Yogi Bear, things like that. So they were just kind of around.
How old were you? Were you a kid?
Well, some of them are dated as far back. I was born in 66. Some are dated as far back as 67. So, it's just things we acquired. But, I didn't know anything about how to collect comics or where they were sold. It's just, people would give them to me as gifts or say, "Hey, Mark, might like this," and it's like, "Yay!"
So as a kid, you started to read them, obviously.
Yes.
And what drew you to them? Was it the art? Was it the writing? What drew you to them?
I think initially was the art. I mean, I do remember this, which is really weird, but and I was probably like 3 years old. One of the earliest issues of Casper that I had is number 110, and I remember that there was a story in it that originally my parents would read to me, and then I wanted to have them read it to me again, and they said, "Well, you figure it out," and I distinctly remember, just kind of reflecting on it, that there was a time where I remember I couldn't read it, but I was trying to figure something out because of the pictures, and then later I did learn how to read, and I, for some reason, thought my story that I created prior to learning how to read was better than the one that it actually was. Now, I don't remember what I used to say. It was just impressions in my mind back when you're a little kid, 3, 4, 5 years old.
Do you think you learned how to read a little bit by reading comics?
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
Certainly.
The helper for me was I was a charter member of the Sesame Street group. My parents like to say, when Sesame Street came on, we sat you in front of the TV on day one. And okay, because I was like 2.5 years old. I don't remember it per se, but I have seen that very first episode again. And yeah, I remember that stuff. Of course, they repeated segments many times over, but still, I was there from the beginning.
At what point did you start to study it as a serious study?
Study. Well, I mean, I learned how to where you could buy comics probably when we went to Hawaii in 1973. So I was like 6 years old.
Okay.
When we moved to Southern California, like the next year, I kind of figured out that the older ones had some sort of value to them, you know, but I didn't really know history per se, but I was always kind of curious about that over time. What helped a lot is I probably got the first Overstreet. I did get the first Overstreet price guide in 1976, and that opened like floodgates on. Oh, okay. Well, there's all these different publishers. I didn't even think about different publishers doing things. I just thought like superheroes. Oh, just they're all published. I didn't realize Superman's DC, Spider-Man's Marvel, blah 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 blah. And things like that. And so I suddenly started in my mind or whatever categorizing everything and go, oh, these guys do this guy does this.
Well, what prompted you in the first place to get that guide, to get the Overstreet?
Because I was curious about like a lot of the comics I was reading about that time. Is like, some of it had pretty high numbers, like well over 100 sometimes. And I was like, well, how far do these series go? When do they go? And I found out like Action Comics went back to when my dad was born. And I go, wow, it's as old as my dad, It's like, I thought that was ancient, and at the current time, I think it was around number 400 or something. And so, it was just like, just basic curiosity. And since nobody would talk about stuff like that, I took it upon myself to kind of, you know, anything you would find, there's no internet or anything. So anything you would find about comic books, I absorbed it. I mean, there was a magazine when I was a kid called Dynamite, and they reprinted like Origins. And there was those books that came out, which actually they just put out as a 50th anniversary, the Marvel Origins book, Fireside book. And, then I started saying, oh, yeah, well, that's interesting how these comics started, because by the time I was reading them, they were well established. You assumed you knew the history, and sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Like in the case of Superman, I knew the basic story on how Superman came to be. But like Fantastic Four, by the 70s, I didn't know how it came to be. They just were, things like that.
And that's true for a lot of kids, especially today. They only know the history from going to the movies. They don't even necessarily know it from
Right.
reading the comics. So did you then turn that into some kind, obviously you've turned it into a kind of a
Yeah.
career in a way. I mean, were you always thinking about how does this work and who are these people? Was that something that fascinated you early on?
Yeah, I mean, I always was kind of that way, but I wasn't trying to turn it into a career, or I never even thought I was the writer. I would, take like notes and stuff like that on, books I read and stuff like that. Other people would highlight books and stuff like that, but I would tend to just take notes on note paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I would catalog stuff, I would organize stuff. And if there was a list of like something, I found out, that the book that I was reading was incorrect, I would make my own list and stick it in the book saying, this is the real accurate list that they forgot, And, it never occurred to me to write to the author saying, you left out this or something. It just was like, I just know more information than that guy, and I'll put it in the book. So,
well, my having read your two books, which are close to 900 pages worth of material on Mad Magazine alone, and it's very comprehensive and very detailed. So clearly you have a real love of those details.
yeah, I've always been highly detailed oriented. Fortunately, I have a publisher, which has usually been Omar over at Bear Manor Media, that allows me to do something as comprehensive as a 2-volume Mad book. I mean, another publisher might say 900 pages. You better cut that down to 500 and take out stuff, And it's like, well, if you want the complete story, this is it. I mean, I do cut it down, believe it or not, because you get like 37 interviews with 37 Mad creators. You're going to hear the same story over and over and over. I can't tell you how many times they talked about the Mad staff going to Haiti to meet the one Mad reader that didn't resubscribe, so they went to his house and got him to resubscribe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been told 27 different ways by as many creators, and it's like I said, I got to pick out the best version of this story, or people will be bored to tears seeing the same story over and over. Yeah.
And you have managed to make it very granular. It's pretty detailed.
Yeah.
Do you think that being that detailed is helpful in terms of the way that the audience looks at Mad Magazine?
Well, I mean, I do try to cater to the audience, but sometimes I'm trying to cater to myself. I will name a couple other authors over the course of time because I started to develop other interests, which I have now. I always say that my interests are comic books, animation, movies, TV, and music. So, and I've written books, and that's what the podcast is about, those basic subjects. An author that I like that I later became friends with is Steve Cox. And he wrote books on various TV shows like Green Acres and I Dream a Genie and different shows that I just happened to watch over time. He got the interviews, and he showed pictures of like the merchandise and, you know, different things like that. For me, I said, I like the way this guy writes because it's a pleasant reading style.
Sure.
You know, conversational, I guess, is the way you could say it. But it's not, you know, being really highbrow saying, well, and I'm like a big fan of the Beatles. There are Beatles books like that. They're very sophisticated and, you know, learned and stuff like that. And I go, oh. And they have lots of footnotes and end notes and this notes and that notes. And I like just, you know, reading something straight through. If you're going to reference something, just reference it in the text. And that's the way that I write. I don't have somebody flip to the back of the book and find out where that quote came from. I find that really disturbing and, you know, not disturbing. What's the word? You know,
it's annoying.
Just annoying is a better word. Yes, thank you. You know.
Well, you are clearly writing about things that are entertaining. They're in the entertainment industry and they are entertaining in some way. Most of what you write about is not deeply intellectual stuff in the first place.
Right.
So what you write about should be somewhat entertaining too.
Yeah, and that's what I try to do. So if that came across, then I've achieved my goal. You know, because I'm the worst audience for my own stuff. Is like, well, it, you know, looks good to me, you know, but I've had people read it, you know, prior to it being published saying, well, this isn't entirely clear. You know, you haven't really mentioned, you know, who Steve is or whatever, you know, and it's like, oh, yeah, I forgot to put his last name and explain who he was, you know. You know, things like that.
Well, when you write that much, you're going to fluff over some things inadvertently.
Right. Because in my head, I'm like, oh, I know who Steve is. You know, he does this podcast. You know, I'm fine. You know, and I go, wait a minute. I have to think about somebody who's just reading this for the first time. I have to introduce this person like a new character into the book. And so, you know, I made sure, using the Mad book as an example, you know, whenever I brought somebody new in, let's say, and then Harvey Kurtzman came into the offices and tried to get a job. Well, if I just leave it at that and never say who Harvey Kurtzman was, then people are going, who, what, why, well, who is he? Who cares? So then you have to kind of describe, you know, I'm assuming you've never heard of him. You know?
For those listeners who don't know who Harvey Kurtzman was, who was he?
Well, he's credited as the creator of Mad Magazine. That's the easy response. But prior to that, he worked at EC Comics, which was the publisher of Mad, and still is. And he created 2 war-themed comic books, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. Prior to that, he worked for Marvel Comics when it was referred to as Timely, and he did these fun comic pages called Hey Look, that were just a one-page gag filler strip that would appear in various Marvel or Timely comics. Prior to that, I mean, I guess he was in school and things like that, but you know, now I'm doing overkill. But I mean, you know, it's kind of a basic introduction that I want to kind of bring people up to date. Okay, you know, why was this guy qualified to create a Mad magazine? Well, he did humor stuff in other publications, and he also wrote and drew other stories for the same publisher, things like that, and edited too.
And he was working for the infamous and well-known William Gaines, who was the publisher
Right.
of Mad, correct?
Correct. Yes.
All right. So, what was it about William Gaines that made him unique?
I think because in general, he had different vision than most publishers. He had this kind of attitude of I couldn't care less, only because, and I explained it in the Mad book. His father died in a boating accident, who was the founder of the EC Comics line, and he wasn't planning to inherit this company. He wasn't planning to be the publisher. He wasn't planning to do anything. He was planning to become a school teacher. And when his dad passed away, this company was foisted upon him basically, and he could have continued it the way it was, but I don't think he would have found that very enjoyable. It was a lot of, Bible stories and children's comics and things like that. But Gaines had other ideas. He said, like me with my books, it's like he wanted to publish things he'd like to see himself. He liked horror, he liked science fiction, he liked westerns. So why not publish things about that? And he did.
In life, you should be doing those things that really make you happy. You shouldn't be trying to please others, especially in the entertainment business. You should try and please yourself first. And if you have any taste at all,
Right.
others theoretically will also be entertained by it.
Right.
When you're writing your books, do you think of yourself as a storyteller?
At times, especially because a lot of these books I've written don't necessarily lend themselves to a story per se.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, when the people were creating a lot of these, publications, and you could name any of them, Mad, Cracked, Harvey Comics, Archie, whatever, they weren't sitting there, it's like, oh, we're doing this today, and, being hyper analytical about what they're doing. I mean, they do have an ultimate goal in mind. Yes, we're going to create some popular characters that will give a big return on our investment and we'll be rich. Bluntly, that's really what they're trying to do.
All about the money.
But there's interesting storylines that kind of weave in and out just because of things that happen. I'll keep using Mad as an example because that's probably the easiest to do.
Excellent.
There's so much history. It's like they're going along doing parodies of song lyrics called Sing Along with Mad, saying, hey, that would be a fun insert to put in one of our super special annuals. And then they get sued because now the songwriters are citing copyright infringement to their songs and blah, 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 opening a big lawsuit and everything like that. Well, who could have foreseen that? But it's an interesting story, even though it's probably nerve-wracking for Gaines and everyone else because they could theoretically lose the company. But then the suit was settled that, and it did help people later on like Weird Al and Alan Sherman and all sorts of people that do parody lyrics, that you can do parody lyrics on things. You really don't.
It's not a violation of copyright
Right.
to do so.
But they needed that court case to kind of confirm that instead of just Mad assuming that. And Mad had difficulties with that early on. It's like they did a parody of Superman and DC said, hey, you're not supposed to make fun of our sacred Superman character. Why not? It's parody. Time and again, they got, by the good graces of everyone, got seen as parody is in their favor, that, what they're doing is not wrong. They're not expressly saying that they own Superman, but they certainly can poke fun of it, including the name by calling it Super Duper Man instead of Superman. Things like that.
So what do you think it is about Mad Magazine in particular? I have my own feeling on it, but what makes Mad so great? What makes it special and great?
Well, I'll just tell you how I discovered Mad. So I discovered Mad 50 years ago.
That's amazing because you're only 28.
Right, exactly. My sister actually found it. There was a Mad Super Special that had these Don Martin art posters. And if you're familiar with Don Martin, he drew like these wacky characters that had bent feet and, had weird sound effects like floobadoov and schizophrits and whatever. And they did some sort of, usually it is one page gag, some sort of grotesque thing happened. Like the guy's head would get run over in the barber chair, and then the steamroller would pave his head and paint his head. And then the punchline was, that looks great, but you got the part on the wrong side. Things like that. Yeah. A typical example of, kind of grotesque humor brought back to earth in just kind of a mundane situation. But immediately my eye was attracted to his artwork. That was the guy. And I said to my mom, can I have this? And, these posters were full color. They were on nice paper. They looked really neat. Of course, I pulled them out and stuck them on my wall. And the rest is history. I was a confirmed buyer ever since. And then the one story, and I think I do relate it in my book. Then my dad says, "Oh, I read Mad when I was a kid too," and I was like, I didn't believe him because I thought my dad was too nerdy or square to even think of something like Mad, as something to buy. And he was reading the Kurtzman comic book issues, the early ones. And, then the next Mad special that came out, they had a reprint of one of those comic books. And I go, I guess you're right. And my dad said, of course I'm right. It's like, how do I know? My dad used to kind of bend the truth at times, because, what's the point of having kids if you can't mess around with them every so often?
So you were drawn to both the art and the humor.
Yeah.
You can't really have Mad Magazine without both combined.
Right. I've gone on record as saying this about the 4 major humor magazines that were around when I was a kid. There's Mad, Cracked, Crazy, and Sick. And there's also National Lampoon, but that kind of goes outside the scope of the black and white humor magazine. We'll say that.
All disease.
Yeah, it's like I used to say, Mad is the best because it has good art and good writing.
Mm-hmm.
The fault I had with Cracked at the time was I thought it had great art or good art, and the writing was kind of Crazy. I thought had the opposite problem. I thought it was funny, but the artists sometimes were like, ugh. And then Sick, I thought had, at least at the time I was reading it, bad art and bad writing. And I said, how is this still being published? And of course, that was the first one to go under in 1980. So I found out that, the best thing to do is have good art and writing on these things.
That helps. That helps a lot.
It seems obvious, but some people don't understand that. And they wonder, well, what did my comic or publication end? Well, it wasn't very funny, or the artwork atrocious.
So a lot of what's in Mad, I think, is or was, and may to this day still be, somewhat, if not a great deal, politically incorrect.
Yeah.
And it plays with various tropes and with our society and culture and all those things. I'm just wondering if you think if no one had ever created Mad Magazine, would they be able to start something like it up today, or would they be, no way would they get away with it?
It wouldn't be a magazine if they started it today.
What would it be? It'd be online.
It would be something online.
Yeah.
I think the equivalent now is like TikTok videos, maybe, just little short skits that you sometimes see online.
Mm-hmm.
TV wise, Saturday Night Live still tries to carry on that tradition, even though, everybody usually says it's not as funny as it used to be. But they used to say that about Mad. It's not as funny as it used to be.
Well, I used to love watching Mad TV when it was on.
Yeah. So,
I thought it wasn't exactly Mad Magazine, but it had kind of that, it was different from Saturday Night Live, and it was even a little more whacked out. It was a little further out there.
Right. But there's elements of humor. I mean, if you're talking about when the time Mad started in 1952, well, I mean, there were humorous comic books if you count like funny animal comic books, like every cartoon character had their own comic book back then. And, you could say they're funny. But I guess for the most part, it was pretty much gentle humor, even though, like I said, Kurtzman had his Hey Look pages in the 40s. And Basil Wolverton had things like the Culture Corner over in Fawcett Comics, things like that. And of course, he worked for Mad later too. So there was a few wacky people out there, but I think Mad was probably the one that actually kind of brought him home to roost to like be under the same umbrella instead of just a filler page and something. Could somebody have come up with a Mad? Possibly. I mean, there were predecessors to Mad, like Ballyhoo and things like that. A lot of them didn't have a lot of artwork. A lot of them were kind of like joke books, and they might have single panel gags. So it wasn't the exact same format as Mad, but it could have come somewhere along the line.
How important do you think Mad Magazine in particular has been over all these years? How important has it been to culture in general?
I think it was very important, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much since. I mean, I hate to say there's people now that never even heard of Mad Magazine, or they go, "Is that still being published?" And I used to say yes for a number of years. Now I say yes barely since it's in reprints. But uh,
Well, it's hard to keep that up with all of the various attention grabbers that
yeah,
are out there. Back then, there were very few attention
yeah.
grabbers. Now there are thousands of them.
But yeah, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, those particular decades especially, yeah, people would look forward to the parody. There'd be a new show like Star Trek, let's say, coming on, or Batman, or whatever. Oh, let's see what Mad will do next month. Some movie come out, The Godfather. Let's see what Mad does next month. And it's like things like that. And Mad was like the pulse of whatever was popular. I mean, I have to admit, the very first time I heard of Harry Potter actually was Mad Magazine, because
Hmm.
I was already an adult when the book started coming out. And there's plenty of children book series that have come down the pike, since I was a kid. So I might have seen it glancingly, just bookstore in the kids section, but it didn't really impress me one way or the other. They had not done the movies yet. And Mad put it on the cover, and so at that point I said, if Mad is discussing this, it must be something to pay attention to. And sure enough, it was, because in the next few years she finished the books, and there was 8 movies and even spin-off movies and other things, to this day.
I would argue, and I'm curious if you agree, that if it weren't for Mad Magazine, you would not have things like the Firesign Theater or Monty Python or Saturday Night Live. I don't think those things would exist without Mad.
Definitely Firesign Theater and Saturday Night Live. Monty Python, I don't know if in England they read Mad as voraciously as the people in the US. I mean, it was published a significant period of time, but you talk to the Python guys, and they cite their references more as the Goon Show on radio.
Oh, and the Goon Show, of course.
Although, interestingly, John Cleese and Terry Gilliam worked for Help, which was a Harvey Kurtzman publication, came after Mad started in the 60s, and he used John Cleese in one of those Fumetti things where Cleese is falling in love with a Barbie doll. And, I have to say, by that point, if they have not seen Mad Magazine, they're just blind. So they must have seen it somewhere along the line, but they never cited it as an influence over there.
Well, as it's true for a lot of things in art and science and culture, sometimes there's just something in the water at that time in history, and many different
Yeah.
creators and discoverers are discovering and creating things that are similar in nature at that same moment, even though they're completely disconnected.
Right.
That I think may have happened, that there was that period in the, as you say, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s with that kind of humor that I think has dwindled somewhat. I think it's now gone back to a little bit more meat and potatoes and a little less completely off the wall out there stuff, which I really love. That's my particular proclivity. But while you were doing your research on Mad, what did you come across that was like a eureka moment that you knew nothing about, that kind of like really blew your mind a little bit? Was there anything?
Probably anything that came out more recently. I mean, there's a few things in the early days, but there's been other Mad histories. I even reference them in the book. I say, there's other Mad histories. I didn't even want to do a Mad history because I figured it's already been done. But then I realized that the most recent version of the Mad history was published like in 1993. So you got like 30 years of things that aren't or weren't covered. Now, longtime readers may argue, well, those are the crummy years anyway, but it's like, I wanted to know. I kept reading Mad, even after everybody quit the publication or passed away or whatever, because I've always been curious. I subscribe to it now. I always am curious as to what they'll do next. But probably the most interesting stuff was like the more recent stuff that isn't covered anywhere. There's an exhibit that was showing Mad art at the Norman Rockwell Museum, but they did a piece on it on Sunday morning. And if you watch it, they give the impression that Mad ended in 2018 after 550 issues, and that's it. That's all she wrote. And well, it's still being published. It started over again. It actually started over with brand new issues, edited by Bill Morrison, who worked for The Simpsons. And even he was kind of peeved on Facebook and social media that he wasn't even mentioned that he brought Mad back. And it's reprints now, and he's no longer part of it. But one of the things he did, and it actually makes for an interesting later story that I didn't know anything about, but I interviewed him about it and Tom Richmond, the artist, about it, is Quentin Tarantino, the filmmaker, is a big Mad fan, and he wanted Mad to be present in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Right.
And so originally he just contacted Tom Richmond out of the blue because he knew, oh, he's a Mad artist. He can kind of draw like the Mad magazine artists of the past that are no longer with us. So maybe he can recreate a TV guide cover or something. And then it expanded to, can I also do a Mad cover since I work for Mad? And can I actually do a parody of this story in the actual Mad magazine of this fictitious TV show that's in this movie? And it just kind of blossomed out of there. That whole story wasn't told anywhere, even in the press or anything. It just, the movie came out, you saw Mad in it, and life goes on. But I was curious about it because why were they doing so much parody? Why was there so much connection? And so I like uncovering things like that.
So when you were creating the work itself, were you needing to get rights to anything? Pictures, stories, anything like that? Did you need any kind of rights clearances?
Well, I'm savvy enough doing this for a number of years to know what I can do and what I can't do with what they call the fair use.
Mm-hmm.
Couple things I was trying to slip by, but it didn't work. But I'll explain that in a second. But typically, I know Mad is very possessive about their artwork, and they don't want anybody reprinting anything, even in part, of their articles and art and everything. That's their job. They don't want some third party, especially is not authorized by the company, doing anything. So I knew that. And so I made special whatever to make sure I didn't have a lot of artwork from the publication. I can't say I did that 100%, but I mean,
No, you have covers and all kinds of things in there.
yeah, well, the covers are a little bit different. Covers are kind of more like fair use because, I mean, there are websites like Grand Comics Database that has all the covers. I mean, are they going to be taken down because they put all that up? I think early on, sites like that and Doug Guilford's Mad cover site got in a lot of trouble, and that's even in the book, because what are you doing putting our precious cover art on the internet? Nowadays it's like it's all over the place. But New Frontier, we didn't know what was going on, but
Right.
I knew I couldn't do that. I also knew that even though like Alfred E. Newman as an entity is basically a public domain character.
How's that? How did he become public domain?
Because it was originally used in advertising that dated back to like the 19th century. Painless dentist ad where the tooth was missing and it didn't hurt a bit, things like that. And Mad went through a whole lawsuit trying to figure out, who owned this thing, because they just started using it just arbitrarily, this tooth missing character. And then they dubbed it Alfred E. Newman. He didn't even have a name. It was just a What Me Worry kid or something like that. But people started writing, well, my father created that character in 1903, and you owe me $1 billion because, back royalties and everything like that. And they're going, good grief, And so they took their lawyers and figured out, they'd find instances of the character used prior to that. And so that, totally negated their ownership. But what Mad did is they got artist Norman Mingo to create a definitive version. That's the version that's theirs.
That everyone knows.
So if I use that or anything that's been published in the magazine, especially if I call it Mad and have the name Alfred E. Newman all attached to it, they're going to come down on me. But I was very careful.
Mm-hmm.
So I put up the cover prior to it being published saying, coming soon, my Mad book. And Mad's lawyers came after me. And it was like the only time I've ever really gotten a lawyer involved. And so he made me make a couple changes here. One is I was using the actual Mad logo, and that is a trademark logo. So I said, well, what if I use something similar? So this isn't the real Mad logo.
So it's a faux Mad logo.
Yeah, and he was okay with that. This is the way lawyers speak, because he never gave me full approval, but he said, we're not going to bother you. That's about the best I got.
This magazine that has spent 70 years parodying and satirizing things can't handle their own satire.
Exactly. I know. This is still in the proper typeface, but it's not, Mad. Anyway, he also emphasized I had to put unauthorized in different color and large enough so that people could read it on the cover. Fine.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. And I also had to put interviews with Mad writers and artists on here. And I go, fine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the other thing he quibbled about is we did slap an Alfred head. It probably is a Norman Mingo Alfred head, but I figured if I covered it up with a paper bag, you know, and the guy was freaking out because he thought it was Alfred. And this drawing or painting is actually of my friend Lee Hester, who runs a comic book shop called Lee's Comics. And it's actually Lee's head, no paper bag, just Lee's head. And I asked Lee, he's a good friend of mine, I asked him, can I use this for the cover? And he goes, sure. And I go, I got a great idea that'll be funny. You won't be on the cover, but I'll do something. And then he loved this, the whole Alfred in disguise.
In a bag.
And so then I started promoting the book saying, I have a Jack Davis cover. And oh my God, so many people were like, how did you do that? He's been dead for 7 years. You know, it's like he did artwork that didn't appear in Mad, folks. And he did commissions all the time. So that's where that was. But yeah, Mad came down on me on that and said, you can't publish it as is. So I changed the logo. He finally gave me clearance, as it were, for Alfred, the way it was. And then on the copyright page, I had to change the copyright to the way Mad likes their copyrights, which, without looking at it, I don't remember how they do it.
There was a bit of a hassle for you to get it there.
Yeah, but it was less of a hassle than, like if I picked pieces from all the different artwork over the year, had Mole and Super Duper Man, and
then you'd really have to get clearances.
Yeah. And he asked me that. He says, you don't have a bunch of artwork in there. I go, no, I don't. I have a bunch of photographs of the creators, and well, he couldn't do anything much about that.
So, all right. So speaking of the creators, you have lots of interviews in the book. I mean, lots and lots.
Yeah.
How many of those people did you actually interview?
I probably interviewed about 30 or 40 people over the years.
And how difficult was to set those interviews up?
Not very difficult. I mean, I'll say this, on interviews with people who have passed away, I went through and got the best archival interviews I could. I mean, Comics Journal used to do great interviews with Gaines and Feldstein, the later editor, and things like that, and various artists over the years. There's also some Mad-related publications. They gave me permission to use their interviews. One was called Mad Freaks USA, one called the Mad Panic, one was called the Journal of Madness. They all had interviews of creators that are long past. And I said, can I reprint stuff from that? And I wasn't reprinting the interviews verbatim all the way through. But I mean, if I'm writing about how the Fold-In was created and there's like this choice interview with Al Jaffe that he's talking about it, well, I want to be able to grab it instead of just telling the story. I'd rather have him say it in his own words, what inspired him to do the Fold-In, things like that.
So over time, was there any material that you wished you could have gotten, aside from the obviously copyrighted stuff? Was there anything you wished you could have gotten that you didn't, or anyone that you wished you could have spoken to that even though they were alive, they wouldn't let you?
There was nobody that really outright refused me. There's people that were hard to get. Sam Viviano, the art director, he was a late edition. And I actually had the book. I actually even sent it off to be published. And he says, wait, I'll do your interview, and it's like, I contacted Ben at Bear Manor, and I said, Sam Viviano wants to be interviewed. And I've interviewed him before because I interviewed him for the Crack book too. And he will give a lengthy interview, which he did. He talked to me for 4 hours.
Wow.
Can we hold this book? And he goes, absolutely. So, and Viviano was great in giving further information about basically the last 20 to 30 years when he was there, which was very helpful because it was getting to be, I hate to say, it was getting to be just like a list of just the new issue and what was in it. And I said, I need a little more material for this later stuff. So I was very happy to get that. The only disappointment, I guess, is John Ficarra, the longtime editor in New York, always has turned me down. I think he just turns everyone down because there's very few interviews with him anywhere. So he's not really, I guess he doesn't consider him the spokesperson for Mad. I mean, he has been interviewed.
Clearly he doesn't like to be interviewed.
Yeah. So the people that do, Sam Viviano does after a little urging. And then I got Dick DeBartolo. He loves to be interviewed, so I got in for the book. And some people I didn't bother because, I don't know, it's like there's a lot of interviews. I didn't interview Sergio Aragonés. I met him a few times. And some people I interviewed back on the crack books, and I said, well, if I interview him again for the Mad book, I'm not really going to ask him anything I didn't ask before. So I can use some of that material that didn't appear in the crack book in the Mad book, because I was smart enough when I interviewed for the crack book. I said, I'm going to ask about Mad and everything else, because I didn't think I was going to do a Mad book, but I said, I just want to know, and you never know, I might use it somewhere. And I did. So.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a little bit of your other work too. You've obviously worked on subjects like the Turtles and the Monkees and the Beatles. Your fascination for music, did that happen around the same time you were getting into cartoons and animation and magazines?
Kind of. I mean, I didn't develop a strong love for it probably until like the late 70s. In the early 70s, late 60s, I mean, things were tied in. Like, my parents got me the Sesame Street book and record. And obviously that tied into Sesame Street, and I got a Mr. Rogers album that tied into Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So, things kind of tied in there. I wasn't really into, say, rock and roll or whatever, but, my mom would listen to the radio, and occasionally she'd buy a 45 or even an album of some artist. And so we had various artists' albums around, like Ike and Tina Turner working together, which had Proud Mary on it, and Janis Joplin's Pearl that had me and Bobby McGee, things like that. And I didn't know the history behind this stuff. It was just stuff we had and they would buy. I think the big turning point for me is when I became a Beatles fan. And I tell this story, but I'll tell it again. I was already a Monty Python and a Saturday Night Live fan.
Right.
And Eric Idle appeared on Saturday Night Live in 76, and he did this bit, which is on, I'm sure, online, and it's certainly on home video, where he comes out and he goes, I'm going to sing you a song. He has a guitar and goes, brum, here comes the sun, brum, here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right. And I'm like, I'm looking at my parents, watching this, and I'm going, what does that song actually sound like? And my parents said, oh yeah, we got that album. It's called Abbey Road, and it has the Beatles. Oh, I've heard of the Beatles. Well, it's like they're walking along the street and everything. It's that album because it say Beatles on the cover. And I go, oh, okay. So I'm like, oh, here it is. Okay. So I put the needle on the record and I go, oh, I've heard this song. It's just Eric Idle was singing it very poorly, and I had no idea what he was imitating. Right?
You've obviously written about some of these famous bands like the Monkees and like
Yeah.
the Beatles. Do you think that there's a similarity in terms of the way that you approach those books to the way that you approach your histories of comics and so on?
Well, there's probably an underlying theme in everything I like. I mean, you've talked to Charles Rosenet before, my co-author.
Twice.
And he probably has said this. If he didn't, he said it on other interviews. One of the things that was appealing about groups like Monkees, Turtles, Beatles, the sense of humor. They weren't like dull drips that just said, oh, we're going to play some music and here we are. They actually had a good sense of humor. They had great personalities. They appeared in films, and they could do actual comedy. I think that helped because comedy was always my first love. Going back to comic books, I always was attracted to more of the humor stuff than the superhero stuff. I like superhero stuff when it's humorous. When it gets too serious, I start to lose interest. So there's that underlying theme about everything that I like. That there has to be some sort of element of humor to it, or I don't like it. I mean, I have a few exceptions. Like I like Twilight Zone, things like that. That's usually pretty straightforward. But sometimes they have humorous things on there, things like that.
So you like to have that comic edge to whatever it is that you're not only looking at, but also writing about.
Yeah, because I don't think everybody should take themselves so darn seriously. Like I'm, doing this proper music, and the Beatles would make fun of themselves. Lennon would make faces on stage while they're playing and stuff like that.
Well, considering the times that we're in right now, which are pretty serious and in some ways quite dire, I guess, we could use a little more what me worry right now, I think.
Yes. Fortunately, Mad's going back to Mad's latest issue, which just came out. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to find. You have to subscribe to it or find it in a comic book store. They actually did about half new material, which is good. And they even put the current candidates on the cover going down a roller coaster, because it is a big roller coaster
Big
ride
roller
for
coaster,
everybody.
absolutely.
So, at least they're still trying to hit the targets. It is more difficult because everybody's so polarizing. I won't name names either way, but it's like, some people are like, how could you make fun of fill in the blank candidate? Mad never did that in the past. And then you go in the past, Mad always was making fun of the candidates.
Always. Sure.
And certainly they're going to make more fun of the candidate that is doing goofy stuff or is in political trouble, to put it mildly, than, the candidate that's just kind of sitting there passively and, everything's great. But even then, they used to do political humor. They poke fun at all the presidents. They poke fun at all the candidates.
And we need, I think, a lot more of it today.
Yes.
To deflate some of these very serious bubbles that we have. Now, you mentioned Charles Rosenet, who has been on the show twice, and that you collaborated with him. And you've had a number of collaborators in your books over time.
Mhm.
What would you say makes a good collaboration work?
Certainly one that I can work with, if that makes sense.
But how do you know that before you start?
I don't always know that. So I've had like 3 or 4 collaborators. I'll use Michael Ventrella and Charles Rosenet as the examples, because Charles, I worked with Turtles, and Michael on the Monkees books. Michael I knew prior because he did a fanzine called Animato about animation. He came to me saying, I liked your Beatles book, but I think you should do a book where it would be like a Siskel and Ebert thing, but about the Monkees. He said, I'd love to do the Beatles one, but your book's already published, so, let's not do a Beatles one again. I go, that's fine. So I go, well, that's a pretty good idea. But at that point, yeah, we were discussing, and I make sure to kind of, like, it's like a job interview, it's like I vet the person, and I'm going to ask him, are you going to be so stubborn about how to do something that I won't be able to get any of my ideas in, or anything like that? And he goes, no, of course, proof is in the pudding to, once you start
Yes,
working with somebody. But I mean, if that started happening, we would discuss things. And for the most part, we were pretty civil about it. And, sometimes he was a little more adamant about something. Sometimes I was a little bit more adamant about something. I remember I wanted to put more information about the Monkees' history in the book, and he was just interested in doing the songs, but he wanted to put in their chart positions, and I wasn't as interested in that. So we kind of came up with a compromise. I said, well, if you want to put the chart positions, I want to put the history. And he goes, all right, we can do that. And so it worked out. We would negotiate like that.
It just makes it a richer book, doesn't it?
Yeah. I wasn't so adamantly opposed. There was some things he would ask my opinion on, and vice versa, and sometimes with a voice of reason, he'd say, well, that doesn't do anything for the book. Let's not cover that, or whatever. Like originally, the original Monkees book was supposed to cover the solo stuff. He vetoed that right away. Now, when we came around to doing a second book, because the publisher wanted a second book, well, what do we do now? We've done everything in the other book. And I go, well, now we could do the solo stuff. It's kind of funny. I think he was more into the first book than I was, and I think I was more into the second book than he was. And it was mainly because other Monkees books had been written, so I thought, we're kind of, going on the same territory. Whereas the solo stuff, nobody had ever really covered before, so I was more excited about that. So,
did you get to talk to any of the Turtles or Monkees or any of the Beatles that are left?
Beatles, no. Monkees, we didn't talk to any of them specifically for the book, but I had met face to face every one of the Monkees over time and got to chit chat with them and stuff like that, and seen them in concert and things like that.
Same with the Turtles.
Turtles, for the book, Charles got Howard Kalin. I was trying to help him get him and everything like that. He did the podcast with this other guy named Plastic EP. He's this Australian guy, which is how Charles and I actually met on his podcast. So they did the interview, and I was cool with that. But I did supply questions for Charles to ask, and of course, some of the questions were a little out there, but I wanted to know. in Howard's autobiography, he talks about that he used to do these little records on Coney Island for himself when he was like a teenager, and a kid, just singing and stuff into a microphone. And you get a little record and you take it home. But he mentions this, but he didn't say anything else about it. And so I was kind of curious, would you ever put those out on an official release saying the Turtles when he was a kid, or something like that? And Howard was like, who'd want it? But it was like, I wanted that reaction because I wanted to see what he'd say about it. I mean, you might say, oh, that's a good idea, which, sometimes happened. But I was just curious about it because he just kind of offhandedly threw it out there and never said anything more about it. So I tried to do that, is find answers beyond what somebody's writing about. It's something brings me a question.
Well, that's what a good historian or author should do, is you should be seeking stuff that's not been asked before. So I want to spend half a minute talking about animation before we wind the show down a little bit. I'm just curious, do you think there are any animated properties that should be revived?
Only if they do it right. I'll put the qualifier.
I wrote an episode of the 1990s X-Men.
Mhm.
And they've now recently revived it for X-Men. They call it X-Men 97, but it's today. I mean, they're doing new shows. And it's different. It's not the same thing at all, though they're giving homage to it. Do you think there are any other types of shows that you admire and think maybe they should revive or do new episodes of?
Only if they could do it right. I always was a fan of Freakazoid when it was out.
Mm-hmm.
And they only did 20 episodes or something like that. It was never immensely popular, which is probably why they haven't done them again. But like I said, if they can do it right and bring back the same kind of humor, an example that's similar to that they did bring back, but it was a little bit shaky, but I liked it, is they revived Animaniacs, which was kind of on the same thing. They brought back the same voices, but they didn't bring back any of the old writers, which I thought was kind of strange.
That's the way they do it. They will just eliminate all the old writers and think that they can do it themselves, and they don't know what it was like to do it back then. It's a real problem.
And then the revivals I always hate are the ones that are so completely different. It's like, why didn't you create something brand new? It's like
Exactly.
The characters don't have the same personalities. They don't look the same. It's like, I'm not citing anything in particular. I'm trying to think of one. Well, they've done it with Donald Duck. I'll use that. It's like, to me, Donald Duck should be fluid animation and he should look like Donald Duck. I know there's been wonky ones they've done over the years where, I think UPA, one of the other studios, did some Donald Duck commercials where it looks kind of UPA style and stuff like that.
Well, sure.
Yeah, but a little one-off, that's fine. But, to do an entire series, like they did a Looney Tunes series somewhere where they gave them huge feet for no reason. And was the show funny? It was okay, but it's like, why?
Was it Looney Tunes or Lunatics Unleashed?
Lunatics Unleashed is another one that they did, but I think it was called Looney Tunes. But they had big feet.
And I wrote several episodes of Lunatics Unleashed.
Okay, that was a little bit different. And that one took an idea. That's a little bit different. And I'm not saying that because you're here.
Different.
That's taking an idea and kind of morphing it into something kind of new.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit different. What I'm talking about is when you're doing arguably what's established, the same thing, and other than the name, they're really not, and they do this all the time with live action things. Like, I love the original Hawaii Five-O. We use that as an example. Part of it, the charm was Jack Lord was the by-the-book guy, and, he had Dano with him, was kind of like a little more loose, and, he had all his other sidekicks that were a little more loose and doing the crime fighting and everything. But Jack Lord is, I forget his character name off the top of my head.
Steve McGarrett,
thank you. Was like the by the books guy, and kind of like Jack Webb on Dragnet. When they did the newer version, they threw all that out the window, and it was just like Baywatch. It was just young kids. They're kind of doing crime fighting, but they seem like they're having more fun just running around the beach without their tops on. It's like,
Are there any properties that you know of that have never been animated or treated as movies that you think should?
Well, since I'm a big Harvey Comics fan, I always thought that they should have made attempts to animate characters they never did, like Hot Stuff. I know they tried to. There's stories behind that, and There's issues with the Bible Belt not approving of a devil character or whatever. But there's a lot of other characters they never really did animation, like Stumbo the Giant. And I'm trying to think, well, for a long time, they didn't do a good version of Richie Rich. They finally did. Just things like that.
Obviously, Casper got a great big motion picture.
Yeah.
I think several, in fact.
Yeah. They did about 3 or 4. Only one was in the theaters, but a lot were direct to video. So yeah, they did a bunch of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
They're of varying quality. I'm not totally adverse to remakes, and but try to stick to the source material unless you can improve on it. And actually, Casper is an interesting thing because Harvey Comics actually did improve on it. Because originally, it's the famous Paramount cartoons where they just go, "It's a good ghost," and there wasn't much to it. So Harvey Comics, in that case, actually did improve on it. So if you can actually improve on it and write stories in the Enchanted Forest that actually have some action and adventure and humor, well, then okay.
Well, I think everybody that starts out to make those kinds of things thinks they're improving on it. They frequently don't get there, but that they're not trying to make it worse. They're trying to make it so that people will go, look at us, we're even better. But as I say, that doesn't always work out. Well, I've been having a really fun, fascinating conversation for an hour now with Mark Arnold, the author and historian of pop culture, all things pop culture, really. And we're going to wind the show down a bit. And you've clearly been around a while, and you've met a lot of people, and you've dealt with a lot of things in the business. And I'm just wondering, in all of your experiences, do you have a personal, an oddball, weird, quirky, offbeat, or just plain funny story that you can share with us?
As far as pop culture goes, I like interviewing people, and originally I was a little bit shy and it was hard to get into it over the years, but eventually I overcame that, and I pretty much can talk to anybody. It doesn't matter who it is. But the only time I really got starstruck, and it still makes me laugh because it's just how it happened, I was doing an interview for the Total Television book and interviewing this voice artist named Bradley Bulkey, who did the voice of Chumley the Walrus on Tennessee Tuxedo. And I don't know, my impressions of famous people, as it were, they always have secretaries or somebody answering their phone for them, or you get a voicemail or something. And, so I called him up because I was going to ask him to do an interview, or it was time to do the interview or something. I might have emailed him. He said, "Sure, call me this Saturday," or whatever, but I didn't hear him. I just did an email. And so I called him on the Saturday or whatever, and he answers the phone himself. And he goes, "Hello," and he sounds just like Chumley the Walrus. So I'm like, and he goes, "Hello, hello," and I finally got my sense of it. Hi, is this Bradley Bulkey? This is Mark Arnold. I'm here to interview you for my Total Television book. He goes, "Oh yeah, I've been waiting for you." Well, whatever, and it's on an audio cassette. You can hear it. Obviously I didn't transcribe all that into the book, but the only thing I can figure out is it struck a nerve that Tennessee Tuxedo and those underdog cartoons and stuff were things I watched way back. I'm talking about Sesame Street, but in the early comic books, but those TV cartoons were already on. They were on every day of the week. And so just to hear somebody on the other end of your phone line doing one of those voices brought me back to being like 3 years old. And I've met celebrities all over the place. I can name different ones. Alice Cooper, or Huey Lewis. I'm just trying to think of the music ones right now. Jack Lemmon, the actor. Just different people. And it's like, "Hi, how you doing?" "Oh, it's, great." And then you just start chit chatting. It's no big deal. But it was just that one time. I'm like, oh.
Imagine if it had been Don Adams.
It would have been worse. Unfortunately, I guess, Don Adams had passed away by the time I did the book.
Mm-hmm.
So, I didn't get to talk to him. I really wish I had, but.
Very good. So last question for you today, Mark. You've given us a certain amount of pretty good advice along the way here, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice that you like to give to people who are starting out in the business of being a historian or an author or whatever, or maybe they're in just a little bit and trying to get to the next level.
I always tell people, because I figured it out for myself. If you want to be a writer, make sure you like to write. It sounds like a silly thing, but if you don't like what you do, why are you doing it? And if you're doing it solely just for money, forget it. You'll never enjoy it. And do something else. Play the stock market. I don't know. Invest in old comics. I don't know. But if you do like to write, and you have that big novel or that big piece of nonfiction or that history that you think should be out there, and nobody's published it yet, well, people always saying, "Oh, I need to get an agent. I need to do this." And it's like, no, the first thing you need to do is write the damn book. So if you have this great idea, fiction or nonfiction, just start writing it. I mean, all that other stuff will come along in time. It's like if you have a 500-page novel and you go to talk to agents, that's better than if you have an idea in your head of a possible novel you may write someday. Because at least if you have something done, they can look at you. And the only other piece of advice I always tell people is, like, if somebody won't publish you or listen to you or whatever, and a lot of people do this nowadays thanks to YouTube, TikTok, whatever, if nobody will publish you, publish yourself. Eventually you'll get noticed, because if you do it long enough and are sincere with it and everything like that, you'll eventually get noticed.
Well, that is extremely wise advice, because today it's a whole lot easier with Amazon and so on to actually self-publish. There are far more books self-published today than ever before, and they're print on demand as opposed to large print runs that you have to then figure out what to do with massive numbers of books. Now it's all print on demand. That is very wise advice, is that, take care of it yourself. There's no substitute, I think, for doing things on your own when you
Yeah.
can. Obviously, sometimes you need much bigger entities, especially on a TV show or a great big publication like a big magazine run
Yeah.
or something like that. That requires bigger infrastructure. Mark Arnold, this has been a lot of fun for me, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your great energy, and all your wisdom today. And I thank you for spending time with me.
Thank you very much, Steve. Pleasure.
And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great Story Beat episodes to you. Story Beat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.